Emily Dickinson is one of the most famously known poets from the 19th century. Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830, in Amherst, Massachusetts. She spent her whole life in Massachusetts in a house that her grandfather built in 1813. Emily was the middle child with an older brother, Austin, and a younger sister, Lavinia. Emily's parents were Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross Dickinson. Her father was a lawyer who was educated at Amherst and Yale. Edward was elected to the Massachusetts State Legislature and the Massachusetts State Senate. He served one term as a representative for Massachusetts in the United States Congress. Little is known about Emily's mother. She is often seen as a passive wife. Emily's relationship with her mother is distant. Her mother was educated in Monson Academy. They all went to a one-room primary school before going to Amherst Academy. Austin went to Williston Seminary in 1842, while Emily and Lavinia continued at Amherst Academy. Her family had deep roots in New England, and her grandfather, Samuel Dickinson, was the founder of the Amherst College. Emily loved school, the curriculum, teachers, and the students. The school offered students regular attendance at college lectures in all the principal subjects: astronomy, botany, chemistry, geology, mathematics, natural history, natural philosophy, and zoology. The curriculum reflected the 19th century emphasis on science. That emphasis reappeared in Dickinson's poems and letters through her fascination with naming, her skilled observation and cultivation of flowers, her carefully wrought descriptions of plants, and her interest in chemic force. Those interests, however, rarely celebrated science in the same spirit as the teachers advocated. Dickinson's last term at Amherst Academy, however, did not mark the end of her formal schooling. Dickinson left the academy at the age of 15 in order to pursue a higher, and for women, final level of education. In the fall of 1847, Dickinson entered Mount Holyoke Female Seminary School. The school was known for its religious predilection. One part of the curriculum was weekly sessions in which religious questions were examined and the state of the students' faith assessed. The young women were divided into three categories: those who were established Christians, those who expressed hope, and those who were without hope. Emily was in the without hope category. Emily graduated her formal schooling at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary School, and she returned to tend her house. Emily was never married and never had any children. She lived in a secluded life in her home in Amherst, Massachusetts, writing letters and poems. Although Dickinson had begun writing poems by her late teens, few of her early poems exist. Poems dating from the first half of the 1850s draw a contrast between the world as it is and a more peaceful alternative. All her known poems were sent to friends and engage in astonishing imagery, in a direction in which she was encouraged by the popular sentimental book of essays, Reveria's A Bachelor, or A Book of the Heart by I.K. Marvel. She included the pleasures of solitary mental play, performance for an audience, and intimate communion with another. Until Dickinson was in her mid-20s, her writing mostly took the form of letters, and a surprising number of those that she wrote from age 11 onward have been preserved. She sent her poems to her brother, Austin, and friends, Abia Root, Jane Humphrey, and Susan Gilbert. Susan Gilbert is Austin's wife. These generous communications overflow with humor, anecdote, invention, and sombre reflection. Dickinson demanded more from her correspondence than she received. On occasion, she interpreted her friend's lack in replying as evidence of neglect or even betrayal. Indeed, The loss of friends, whether through death or cooling interest, became a basic pattern for Dickinson. Much of her writings seemed premised on a feeling of abandonment in a matching effort to deny, overcome, or reflect on a sense of solitude. In her poems, she wrote with rhyme and strange punctuation. A keen observer, she used images from nature, religion, law, music, commerce, medicine, fashion, and domestic activities to probe universal themes: the wonders of nature, the identity of the self, death and immorality, and love. Dickinson's closest friendships usually had a literary relation. Barrett Browning's work piece, Aurora Leahi, was about the development of a female poet, seemed to have played a formative role for Dickinson, validating the idea of female greatness and stimulating her ambition. She took care of her ill mother and rarely left her room in later life. Dickinson began to restrict her social activity in early 20s, staying home from activities and events with other people. While she was in her reclusive state, she rarely left her home and did not see many people. She died in her home on May 15, 1886, in Amherst, Massachusetts, at the age of 56 from illness. Most of her poems were not published until after she died in 1886, so she did not receive any recognition while she was alive. In Emily's lifetime, she wrote over 1,700 poems about nature and her life. To this day, she is seen as one of the most successful and talented poets in American history.
And my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for my only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then to centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads we were toward eternity. Dickinson personifies death by stating that he takes her on a carriage ride and describing his kindness and civility. She uses consonants in the second stanza where she says labor and leisure. She also personifies grain in stanza 3 by saying gazing grain, as if the grain were able to look steadily and intently. She does this because it gives the reader an image of what the speaker sees as they go on the carriage ride. She continues to use imagery in the fifth stanza where she describes a house as if it were coming up out of the ground. The description. The speaker is dead. The poem is about the speaker looking back at the day of her death. She speaks of it in a calm manner. The setting. It starts when Death picks up the speaker and they drive for a while through her town, past the schoolyard and fields of grain, and eventually to her burial site. It is presumable that the trip took a long time since she begins the poem during daytime and does not reach till night. The setting shifts in the last line when the reader can tell that the poem is read from the afterlife. The title, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, is actually not the title of this poem. Dickinson didn't title any of her poems because she never meant to publish them. In collections, sometimes this poem is given a number, either 479 or 712. These numbers were assigned to the poems after Dickinson's death and indicate the order in which they might have been written, although there is no known record. The symbols. Death. It is in the form of a man, and it is the main focus of the poem. In lines 1 and 2, it seems kind to the author, like the meeting of two lovers. In line 5, death is moving slowly, like an illness. In lines 7 and 8, death is still kind and it lets her take her time. In line 9, the author has joined death. The carriage. The carriage death and the author ride is in the final passage to death. The carriage also holds immortality, according to line 4, where it says that it is just more than just transportation. The sunset. Dickinson speaks of the passing sun, but not the dark and coldness that comes with it, as she wants to avoid the cliché. Meter. Dickinson uses iambic trimeter and iambic tetrameter, which is unstressed and stressed. Rhyme scheme. It is irregular because it does not follow a specific pattern. For example, Dickinson uses me and immortality, civility with eternity, and chill and tool. One of Emily Dickinson's most famously known poems is I Am Nobody, Who Are You? I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. In Emily's poem, she describes herself as a nobody, and the rest of society also thinks of her as a nobody. She engages the readers by asking them, Are you nobody too? She assumes that the reader says yes, and she unites herself with her audience. The speaker fears that even telling anyone that there is now a pair of us will lead to their very identities being advertised, and thus taken from them, for they will no longer be able to be anonymous, free-thinking nobodies that they have chosen to be. The crowds of somebodies can be oppressive, and she tells the audience to not tell anybody because they would enable them to stand apart from the crowd. She uses a simile and compares the nobodies to a frog and an admiring bog because they say their name over and over again to feel significant. I Am Nobody is a more comical poem for people's enjoyment criticizing society. The two stanzas of I'm Nobody are highly typical for Dickinson. She uses loose iambic trimeter, including a fourth stress. They follow an A-B-C-B rhyme scheme, though in the first stanza, you and to rhyme, and no is only a half rhyme. So the scheme could appear to be A-A-B-C. And she often uses rhythmic dashes to interrupt the flow of her poems. In her poem, she was implying that to be a nobody is a luxury incomprehensible to the dreary somebodies, for they are too busy keeping their names in circulation, croaking like frogs in a swamp in the summertime. I Am Nobody is a lyric poem containing 2 quatrains, and the poem alternates between iambic trimeter and iambic tetrameter. The poem is an outstanding early example of Dickinson's often approach to meter. She uses her trademark dashes quite to interrupt lines and interfere with the flow of her poem, as in How dreary to be somebody. Further, the poem vividly illustrates her surprising way with language. In the line, How public, like a frog, shocks the first-time reader, combining elements not typically considered together, and thus more powerfully conveying its message. Overall, Emily Dickinson wrote poems throughout her lifetime, not with the intention of being a great poet, but as somewhat of a personal journal to cope with her feelings. These poems ended up being some of her greatest works in the 19th century.